This is class number 3. I'm Barbara Sweet, class manager. Herb Sweet, my husband, he's over at another computer. He's doing all the AV work. Both of us are on the audiovisual team with CLS. We have our third installment of W G Raymond. Okay, and you can see on the screen the book on the right. Donna Burtch and Bill Burtch, William Burtch, um, they are brothers and sisters. Okay, and they are did this all together. So Bill um, graduated from Franklin University and received his MBA at Miami University. He spent his career in investments working for a large insurance company. He was also a finalist for the American Fiction Short Story Award. His work has appeared in numerous journals and anthologies. His debut collection, Otherwise Wrecked by Sunbury Press, will be released in 2025. He lives in Columbus, Ohio. Donna is an author. She authored a biography of her late father, his naval service in 2020. In the Key of the Sea is the title. Her poetry appears in literary journals, and she also lives in Columbus, Ohio. The sibling co-authors wrote W G Raymond, published it by Sunbury Press in 2022, an award-winning biography of a Civil War figure, W G Raymond. He is their great, great, great grandfather. So please welcome Donna and Bill.
Thanks so much. We're so happy to be here with you. We're coming to you from Columbus, Ohio, from Bill's dining room. And it's another cold day, but not too bad here in Columbus. We're grateful that we have this chance to share with you some of the research and findings in our writings from the journey that we undertook. Oh, let's see, Bill, when did we start? It was in 2020.
2020. In this presentation today, I mentioned yesterday that when the book came out in 2022, we did a lot of presentations and readings and so forth. And undoubtedly, the top two questions were about the opium use, the drug use that was revealed during the Civil War and that afflicted W G Raymond. And then the other was the family, the extended family of WG. He had 10 kids and wives, and people wanted to know how did this work? How was he able to engage in the Civil War and fight, and also carry on a ministry and still, have a large family from different wives. So the purpose of that today is to address those questions, but also to touch base on families in general during that period of time. How did they survive? How did they stay together when so many of them went off to fight the war? And many, of course, never came back, or many came back, maimed. So how did they endure? So we hope to touch on that today. And we appreciate you participating today. One thing we'll mention, this sort of presentation today was part of a series that we had done at a historical group in Columbus, and the talks were a little further apart. So there's some refresher slides here and there that we may just touch on briefly today, since these 3 sessions were grouped together. So we may not need to go through as much of a review. But with that,
yes. Okay. So one thing I do want to say, if you do have questions, there's a chat box. You can pose your questions there. And as we get to the end, we'll address all the questions that we have time to address. And I don't know how many of you are involved in genealogy work, or if you have been gifted perhaps a genealogy, an ancestry review from a relative who's done the work for you. That would be nice. We didn't have that, so we did a lot of the work on our own, and we've gotten new resources throughout our study of family. And what fascinates us, and still does, and we'll continue to try and dig this out, but if women, women who took the names of their husband, which was the common practice of the time and still remains largely today, sometimes it's harder to research their families, their origin families. And I think we've gotten better at doing the research, and more is available online and through the various ancestry sites. I had the privilege and pleasure of going to Utah. It's probably been 15 years ago. And that gave me a big boost because they had a dedicated and a site there that was sponsored by the church that's so prominent there. But I was able to get some starter efforts going then. But what I found with WG and what we've discovered is that his roots go back to England. We have gone back with some robust quality to the 1600s, to the early 1600s. Don't worry, we're not going to go through all of that. But what we found, because you always wonder when you find someone who's from a state, were their family members from that state? From whence did they cometh? And with W G Raymond's father, and grandfather line, he came from Glaston, England. I'm not going, as I said, I'm going to kind of move us through, Bill and I will, without stopping on each of the links within his family. But Richard Raymond was where we start. And he was born in 1602 in Glaston, England. And he came first to Salem, Massachusetts. And of course, Salem has a history that we have read about and know about. But when they arrived here, when his family arrived here, they were mariners, not surprisingly, because they had lived in England, and now they had crossed the ocean to come to Salem, Massachusetts. They were near the water. And this is where I say the research continues, because they came to Salem, they started to establish roots there, and then we show that they moved to Connecticut. Now, why they moved to Connecticut, or what the factors were that led them to Connecticut, we don't yet know. But we do know that when Richard Raymond moved to Connecticut, he married a woman named Judith Williams. And so we have only been able so far, of course, we're talking about 1600. She was born in 1610. She was from Norwalk, Fairfield, Connecticut. So they met. So now they're in Connecticut. And that's where they stayed. The family line there stayed for a time. Out of that union came a son named Abraham Raymond. And Abraham was I'm kind of jumping a bit ahead, as you can tell. Out of that union, I say, but it really means generations, because I don't want to go through every single one you would be leaving immediately. But Abraham Raymond was born in Connecticut. So they were still housed and based in Connecticut now, the family was. And then he married Elizabeth Ray, and they remained in Connecticut until there was this migration that occurred that we're still researching, where they go to Sherborne, New York. And that is where things start to take hold for what is to come with WG and how he ended up in New York, in the state of New York. WG's father and mother, we are looking at them now, and you see a map somewhat there of New York, but his father was John Raymond and his mother was Julia Gould. Gould is a name that we've been asked repeatedly if Robert Shaw Gould, no, Robert, yeah, is related to W.G. I'm sorry, Robert Gould Shaw. He was involved with the 54th of Massachusetts during the Civil War, a prominent figure. We have found lots of Goulds. We haven't found a connection through, that ties W G Raymond, whose middle name is Gould, to that figure from the Civil War history. But WG's mother's maiden name was Gould, and she grew up in New York City and then found her way. There's the other part. How did she find her way to New York and meet with John Raymond and start a family? But they did start a family, and their family ended up they had 11 children, one of whom was W G Raymond, William Gould Raymond. And as Bill announced at the very beginning, the question that we get so often in talking about the life of William Gould, WG, is how in the heck did this man travel? We know for sure he was in New York. We know he was in Pennsylvania. We know he was in Washington, D.C. and Maryland and Virginia. And he was in Illinois, and he was in Kansas, and he went to Missouri, and there was a lot of movement in his life for various reasons, many of which we know. But how did he manage to do that and then contribute as a chaplain, contribute as a provost guard, help to enlist the first federal African-American Union troops, work on the relief efforts after the devastation in Kansas of the locusts, the locust of 1874, the plague? How did he do all of that and still have, while battling an opium addiction that he had acquired after the Civil War, how did he do all of that? And how did he marry 3 wives and have 10 children himself? And then that took us to a different set of questions, which was really important to us, was this a typical family dynamic? And especially as we looked at the Civil War, where we knew that people had moved about quite a bit and that there were tremendous losses, how did families endure, get by, provide for their children when spouses were returning home wounded, maimed, often not returning home? How did that all happen? And we got into it a bit. And the other questions that we want to be sure to address: what was the bond? What was the kind of relationship that WG had to his wives and to his children? And naturally, because we know from present day what a scourge opium is when it becomes an addiction, how did his opium addiction impact the decisions that he made and the life that he had with his family and outside of his family? So you want to, Bill's?
Yeah, just again, these slides, we touched on these yesterday and the day before, but just very briefly. W G Raymond, was, as we know, a Baptist preacher, an infantryman, an officer in the artillery or the infantry. He was appointed chaplain of the Union hospitals by District of Columbia and promoted to lieutenant colonel by Abraham Lincoln to the 1st District of Columbia Colored Volunteers, which became the United States Colored Troops, as we know. I won't spend too much time here. We know that there was a significant dispute between Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton over the introduction of federal African-American troops. There was a kind of a turf war battle that went on, and it was during this time that opium became, infiltrated into the populace, particularly starting with the soldiers. And we touched on W G Raymond's addiction and him stating that his only relief was the use of opium, which he was seldom without. And he said, when suffering, I would have given a large sum rather than be without it. Um, as Donna said, he went off, headed west
After the Civil War.
after the Civil War, became involved in horse breeding and in the railroad effort, as well as the grasshopper plague. And as we talked about yesterday, he did beat his addiction after contemplating suicide, becoming a faith healer in the last chapter of his life, and ultimately being buried at Arlington National Cemetery. So that brings you up to speed on him, and then it's a question of now we're going to address all those questions that we asked in the earlier slides here.
Yes, and one thing that we found, and this will not surprise anyone, I don't believe, but in the era that we're talking about, the opportunity for men and women to get to know each other in order to court, as they would call it, to find a suitable partner to perhaps marry. It was more limited. People didn't, I mean, the opportunities weren't as common as they are today in terms of educational opportunities. There wasn't as fluid a chance for men and women to meet. So how did he meet his first wife? His very first wife was Martha Ferris. And she came from a family. She had been adopted, or rather, I'm sorry, her father had died, and her stepfather was Deacon Ferris. And she was a school teacher. She was, as she is described in WG's own writing, she was a serious person who was pious, and WG described her as being a tremendous helpmate to him. And I think, he to her, they started their life together when he was establishing himself as an ordained Baptist minister in New York. And they had 2 children together. And as you can see, they married in 1843, and they had a child in 1844. Mary was their first child. And then they had a son, Edwin, the following year. Unfortunately, Martha passed while Edwin had just turned 1. So her time with her children was very, very limited. And now WG was left with care of 2 children who were about under the age of 2. And I want to just take a moment to read a brief passage from our book that talks about the death. And what had happened is Martha, we are still uncertain what her demise was involved, what precipitated her demise. But we can say that he described it, that she died a triumphant death. She had been to me a helpmate indeed. We were laborers together in the service of the Lord, but the loss I sustained in death, the loss of her became her gain in their minds, that she went on to have a heavenly experience. But the children, and this, we will talk about it. Was this a common occurrence? But the children were promised to others to rear. And it sounds to me from the research that we've done that Martha had time to kind of procure the adoptive parents of her young children. And so what happened is Hannah Simpson was going to rear Edwin. So the children were going to be split to 2 families, which was, as we will discuss, a more common practice with families at the time, with the kind of strains that were on the families at the time. So Hannah Simpson was going to rear Edwin with the promise that they would adopt him as their child, which they failed to do. And as the relatives got property, it demoralized Edwin as time went on. So we are unclear, as we did the research, how much active involvement WG had with his son Edwin in the early years. We will pick up in later time and tell you a good bit about what they did together later in life. But Edwin went to one family, Mary went to another. They're all described as bright, but who doesn't describe their own family members as bright? But they were promised to also oversee their education. And as we found, both sets of the adoptive parents fell short of their promises. We will, as I say, go forth and discuss how WG and his children reconnected at different points in life. So WG was alone for a 2-year period. And then he was at that time doing revivals and moving about as an itinerant preacher. So he had a couple of churches that he was staffing. And he met a woman named Lumanda Simmons. This occurred 2 years after his wife's death. He had met her during a revival. And again, their ability to court was very minimal. And we should say that Lumanda was the child, her mother had passed away. Her father was Squire Simmons of Brookfield, Pennsylvania. And Squire Simmons had a large farm operation and also ran a mercantile. He had a shop, and he was viewed as being, pretty well heeled, as they would say. And he took great interest in the 2 daughters that he had. So he became aware that there was some interest developing between WG and Lumanda. And his concern with their potential union was one that you would think a father might have, or a mother for their child. And that was that WG was an itinerant preacher. A, they didn't make much money. They still don't. And B, he was going to be, moving her around. If they were to have children, etc., he would be on the move. And that concerned the father, and he was actually opposed to their union. So they did what any 2 young people who think they might have a shot at love would do. They decided they were going to elope, essentially. And so Lumanda was a school teacher, as had been WG's first wife, Martha. Lumanda went to school that day that they got married, just like she always did. And they had arranged for a minister to marry them. WG arrived at the school at the end of her workday, and they scooted off and they got married. As WG tells it, as time went on, he felt that Squire Simmons, Lumanda's father, came to see WG like his own son. We don't know we don't have any record of what Squire Simmons himself might have said, but at least in terms of WG's feeling, Squire Simmons came around and supported the union of Lumanda and WG. And they were together for quite a while, and they had 6 children together. And as you can see there, they had Ella, Mary Ann. So they already had a Mary, WG did. And now they have a Mary Ann. That must have gotten confusing at some points. They had Rosie, and then there were 2 young children who had passed away, but they ended up with a son named Willie. And the picture shows Edwin at the bottom, who was from the first marriage. Willie, they named a person even after another person of their family with the same name had passed away. That was fairly common practice. So they had a son, Willie, who you see in the picture, and then these daughters. So now what happened is after the Civil War, okay, we should back up for a second, Bill, just recap what it was like if you would, when WG announced he was going to leave and do what he did with the service and what his wife was experiencing.
Yeah, exactly. And as we touched on, WG, had an epiphany that he felt that he had to serve in the infantry. He was such a staunch abolitionist that he announced to his wife, who was carrying a child, that he was enlisting and heading off the next day to go fight with the 86th of New York. And she laughed, and thinking must have been joking. He was 43 years old and
A little pudgy.
They had a growing family. He had a congregation, and so on. But he was not kidding, and off he went the next day, which is kind of where the interest in that we've had from people that have read the book developed around how normal was this? How did families left behind like Lumanda, how did they survive? How did they endure? How did they keep the farm up? How did they do all these things? So we'll get into that.
Yep. And with the Lumanda, when WG joined as an infantryman and took off, they had a farm situation, at least a partial farm, and Lumanda and also WG had a brother who lived in that area. And so what we've been able to piece together is while he was away battling and being a chaplain and doing this other work, she had she had a baby there, and then they maintained the farm as best they could. And at the close of the war, WG had an experience or an opportunity to go to Kansas and not only farm, but also he had 3 churches there. And he was involved in the railroad, helping the railroad to gain funding so it could continue its westward expansion. So she and he, Lumanda and WG, made it to Kansas with their growing family. And of course, a lot of things happened at the time. There were a lot of strains on health, and she had had a number of children. She was still a young woman, but she became ill, and we still do not know what the nature of her illness was, but she became ill, and she knew that she was heading to a situation that she wouldn't survive. So she begged WG to please take her back to her childhood home so she could die there and be buried there. So they did. We mentioned this yesterday. He ended up selling horses, and as hard as this was, they returned to Brookfield, and she did as she wished, which was to remain there in her childhood home and pass and be buried on their property. And then WG stayed there for a full year with their children in total grief. He called himself a grave worshiper during that year. And he then went back to Kansas, and that's when the grasshopper plague hit. That at this point, his addiction was in full bloom. And just to reiterate, it was not a street drug at the time. It was a not prescribed even, although doctors did prescribe it. It was more available like aspirin is today. So his addiction that he self-professed was very, very strong. Now he's back in Kansas. He has lost his second wife. His 2 eldest daughters met men who lived in Kansas who had their own farms, robust farms as it turned out, in Auburn, and they were old enough to help WG with the younger children that he and Lumanda had. But what we found, and this was only after we got into the pension records that we mentioned yesterday, how important the pension records were, because this is how we found out that there was a 3rd marriage. In WG's book, he never talks about his 3rd wife in his own writings. He mentions, because we know the timeline now from what we found in the pension records, that he had married a 3rd time. And what we can tell you about this 3rd woman, whom he met in Kansas, was that she was a mother, a young mother. She was 38, and let's say at the time, I think WG was almost, he was in his 50s.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, she had 5 children with a man named William Ketchingman, who had fought in the Civil War. His family had also come from England. But he fought in the Civil War, and she was able to obtain his pension to help in rearing the 5 children she was left with after he passed away. And that man was considerably older than Lucy too. Her husband, her original husband, was older. So what we can't find, what we saw in the research in the pension records was that a woman named Lucy Ketchingman Raymond filed for the pension of W G Raymond. And from all that we've seen, she wasn't successful in that effort because she wasn't married to WG during the time of his service in the Civil War, and she was collecting a pension on behalf of her first husband who had died. So her children at this time were in their early teens, and then she had a child as young as 4 when she met and married WG. We don't know how they met. We know they were in close proximity in terms of the farms where they both would have lived, but we don't have any detail yet on how it is that they came to meet and how it is that they came to marry. All we can say is he never spoke of her in his writings. She appealed with the government to try and get pension and support for her children. We did find that not only did they marry, we found a copy of actually it was a newspaper clipping that indicated that they had gotten married in Kansas. And we also found that they had 2 children together. So by the time this was happening, WG was nearing 60. She was about 39, 40. And she had 2 children with WG while they were married. And interesting to us was that at one time in his life, WG had gone back to Bradford, Pennsylvania, which is where I was born. Our father was born. Bill and I lived as children in Bradford, Pennsylvania. WG had been instructed at one point in his long illness. His illness is related to stomach issues, bladder, stomach, kidneys, everything internal. The doctor told him that he needed to go into the pines. This was a common practice at the time, to go live among the pines and he suggested Bradford, Pennsylvania. And at the time, WG and his family were living across the New York state line. So he did. He went to Bradford and he bought some property there involving a sawmill. So years later, with this third wife, we find in the census records that he and Lucy and these 2 little children that they had together lived in Bradford, Pennsylvania for a brief time. And in his book, and I don't know if I have the exact passage, but I can give you a sense of it. Bill and I we were able to isolate the time frame, and he speaks of having made a terrible mistake that cost him. What did he say? It cost him financially, it cost him emotionally.
Pretty
it was
comprehensive, bad. Yeah.
And the only thing we can think of is it has to be kind of in the same time frame from what we were able to triangulate as his marriage and this. He called it a wild goose chase to Bradford at that time. So they had the 9th and 10th children of WG together. Frank Gould Raymond was born in 1879 in Bradford, Pennsylvania, and Lucy Jane, their daughter, was born in 1880 in Bradford, Pennsylvania. As I said, he described this period which would have been the period of his marriage to Lucy as regretful. And he had spoken so respectfully and perhaps lovingly of his first 2 wives. So it was
a sharp contrast.
Yeah, it was a sharp contrast.
Well, if you remember, we started the presentation with several questions, and we're really trying to understand, how families were able to adapt during this period of time. And what we found, it was not easy, as you might gather.
Yeah.
Um, and women bore much of the burden in preserving the structure of their family. Extended family became critically important. In the case of WG, he had a brother. There was, just
The
acquaintances,
Society of Aid.
society, right, that came together and they helped each other. Try to get through, keep the farm animals alive,
The children.
keep the children alive first and foremost. But not surprisingly, the medical care was poor, and obviously there were a lot of illnesses. And as you've seen, even in the case of WG and his family, the death of spouses and other relatives were prevalent. And so WG, based on what we learned through a lot of research, is that WG's family dynamic, as convoluted and strange as it sounded, was actually not that out of the ordinary for this period of our history. Um, there was a tremendous uh, drain of men out of the society into the war to fight, women in other capacities related to the war, and families were strained to the breaking point, really, across the board during this time. He clearly, WG and his memoirs, clearly painted a life that showed he was away from home for great periods of time. But his memoirs also demonstrate very clearly that he had a tremendous respect and emotional bond to his wives and children, as we mentioned, particularly his first two wives, and his children. He spoke of them throughout his memoirs and their well-being and their lives, and he expressed just really crippling grief on the deaths of Martha and Lumanda. It clearly, he spent, after losing Lumanda, he spent a year basically, at the gravesite. And then, later, he clearly, fits the mold of an absentee father a lot, given his obligations to the service and so forth. But later, he did work closely with several of his children in various endeavors. And he also showed tremendous pride in his children, as I said, throughout the memoir. So the sense we get is that, maybe it's owing to the fact that was not that unusual back in that time, that the children, viewed it as such, that it was a fairly typical situation. And there seemed to be strong bonds between WG and his children, which.
And specifically, just going to look at two of the children, we had talked yesterday, his first two, Mary, who was the first child of Martha and WG.
Hmm.
She went on to marry a man named Ira Goldsmith, who was a boat captain and they were living in New York City area. And they actually took a boat and then made it into, when WG moved into more of his faith healing phase, after his own life had been saved, he felt his own addiction had been cleared. He no longer suffered the pains within his stomach or had bladder or kidney issues. He worked side by side with his daughter Mary in encouraging people, and in many cases that they documented, of helping to heal people. And they used that location in New York City as a hub, and they also used a boat, one of Ira Goldsmith's boats, as kind of a meeting point and a way to move among and along the coasts of the rivers and so forth in New York. Edwin, his second child, who was born of Martha and WG, went on to follow as a man of faith, and he too was a Baptist minister. And Edwin and his wife, Serena Winship, settled in an area of Pennsylvania called Mount Jewett. And Mount Jewett was where our mother partially spent her childhood. But Edwin went on to serve as a missionary, and he was in Kingston, Jamaica. And I know that Barbara's been there. But he ended up dying there, which we talked about yesterday, and was buried at sea there because they didn't want to release his body. But WG was very close to those two, and he also remained close to the children that he had in Kansas who married there. And in fact, his other daughter, whose name was Mary Ann, so we've got Mary and Mary Ann, she ended up dying after having a baby not long after it. And WG describes that like as if the sun set and couldn't rise again, because whenever he felt I don't know, moments of joy or needing space to reflect, he would ride his horse when he was in Kansas over to the farm, and he worked sometimes on the farm in Kansas where his daughter lived with her husband. But when she died, he was really destitute. So as far as the last two children that he had, those are the children that moved west and went to California ultimately. And they're the ones who are related to the cousin we've reconnected with. Well, not reconnected, we never knew until this process. And she lived when we lived in California for a brief time. And she lived in the town next to us, which was really weird. At the same time, we didn't know each other then. But they seem to have gone on and had good lives. And Lucy Catchingman, WG's third wife, lived to a ripe old age in California and spent her last years living with the daughter Lucy that she had with WG.
As we conclude his life, it clearly affected his health physically and mentally, and obviously by extension his family life. It led to suicide ideation, isolation, despair. We talked on this yesterday or the day before, where he wound up holed up back in Washington, D.C. in a small little hotel room, basically. And so it's less clear to us about the impact of the drug on the efficacy of his decision making. He clearly hit bottom. I mean, he was in a situation where he had, lost basically everything when he was in Kansas, and then when he returned when Lumanda died. He was really at rock bottom. So the effect of the drug on his decision making, clearly bad decisions have been made for his life to get to that point. But opium dependency is, like any kind of an addiction, is a family-wide, far-reaching with long-lasting implications. And based on all the work we've done, WG knew this well. And we talked about at the top that at his core, he had a deep faith, other than when he was a young teenager. And he leaned on this faith as the path to freedom from his addiction. And so it was fitting with WG that it would ultimately be faith that would restore him. And it did. And, that's when he went into his later years. immersed in his faith and trying to help
Sure.
others that were dealing with afflictions, you know, within their control and out of their control.
He became a light. He probably always was, but at the end of his life, after a lot of harrowing twists and turns and a lot of losses, he lived a time where he had his faith and health restored, and he put his life into pursuits that he felt would help others. He said he preached some of his best sermons in Virginia at Falls Church and other areas when he was clear-eyed and in his faith was strong again. But he lived a complicated life, and he was a complex man, and we are so encouraged to keep trying to tell the elements of his story, because he owned his weaknesses in his own writing, and he owned the joys of his life too. And
He did. He lived, as we said at the beginnings, he was a very zealous man. He was a very principled man. He had committed beliefs, not only his faith, but in abolition. And those committed beliefs are what drove him throughout life and ultimately drove him out of the pits of his addiction. So, he was a remarkable person to study. You know, we wish we had done it sooner than we had, but it's been a fascinating journey to learn about this man, learn about this period of history, learn about the people that he interacted with, and learn their imprint really on history during that time frame. And and as Donna said, he refreshingly, as we researched, he owned all of his weaknesses, didn't make excuses for any of them, and continued to espouse his strong commitments. So, I mean, I guess overall, in conclusion, I mean, it's not surprising, but that period of time was incredibly difficult on families, and opium tore them further apart. And honestly, when you research that area, you just walk away with just profound respect for the people's ability to endure and carry on and see it all through, see the war through, see through rebuilding their families. It's an incredibly inspiring period of time to study. And with that, I mean, we just want to thank you, and we will entertain questions. I think there might be some in the chat.
Well, and I do want to say the other thing that's encouraging to us is we keep finding new material related to his family. We're continuing to delve into finding more about the marriage, the third marriage, and what that all meant. And I do want to say a couple of real quick things. His lasting contributions, his effort in, if you will recall, we presume that his idea of recruiting and the two African American men to serve as lieutenant.
They were going to be infantry
lieutenants,
officers, right?
That ultimately did happen later, but that he knew that at the right time, that was what he saw. That was important, because if you're going to be recruiting people who had been enslaved and had been put upon as they had, you needed people who could understand perhaps better. So that was one. And the other that we didn't talk about yet was when he was a chaplain and he was in the DC hospitals, the one abuse that he sought to correct right away was, we did say a little bit about it, but the way of the war was so fast and furious that people were being dumped into graves that were poorly made and taken out, with rain coming into the graves, that just poor a poor example of how to treat a person who gave his life, in this case, his life, to the cause of the country to try and unify it. He said, no, this cannot be. And he stopped that grave situation, literally grave situation. And they made improvements to the way the way the caskets were developed, the way they were treated when they passed, and the way that they were buried. And that was a lasting, that is a lasting thing that he did. But his goal always was to try and improve the situation around.
Right. And during his, we may have mentioned this a couple of sessions ago, but during his service as chaplain of the DC hospitals, at the conclusion of his service, as he was discharged, the staff at the hospital awarded him with a 30-plus-pound Bible inscribed to him, thanking him for his contributions to the well-being of the injured.
Mm-hmm.
And that, as we said, that's a next chapter in this, is we hope to locate that Bible somewhere.
Yeah, if you happen to come across
Yeah,
a 30-pound Civil War Bible
Inscribed to
that's
W G
inscribed,
Raymond.
yeah, please let us know.
So I do see a few questions here. Did the cousins of WGs from different wives ever meet?
Yeah, that's something that we need to know. We need to
We're still
continue
piecing
to
that together.
research and see. I mean, it is the cousin that we have out in California. Would be present day. I truly believe we will meet. We have stayed in touch. We do, correspond, but I do know that the children, when the third wife, Lucy, attempted to get pension through WG, her daughter went with one of the daughters I'm sorry. Let me back that up. She took her own daughter, the daughter she had with WG, to try and get the pension, to try and appeal the pension. And then one of WG's wives' children wrote in and said they were not married during the time of service. They were not married during the so the one child was trying to dispute what the other wife's child was saying. So there's some kind of history there. To which wife are we related? We are related to Martha's, the first wife. Her son Edwin married our great-great-grandmother, and then they had a child who ultimately had our mother. They had children who had our mother. And we are in touch with other relatives. Our cousins in Pennsylvania came through that same line, so we do stay in touch with them. And the 30-pound Bible would be heavy reading,
Yes,
Herb. Yes,
That's
it
good.
would.
As far as the Revolutionary War, yes, Abraham.
Going back to we had started with Richard, and then there was an Abraham. There was an Abraham Raymond who did fight in the Revolutionary War, and that's another project of trying to unpack that and find out what we can. We haven't ordered anything related to his time of service, and it's not as compelling if you do that, because it was really during the Civil War that they started to keep pension records. So we'll see where that carries us.
Well, again, we can't thank you all enough, Barbara and Herbie and the Marist College continuing learning group. And I just we love talking about it. We hope to spur interest, and an invitation is extended to channel any questions that come to you later on through Barbara to us, or we would be happy to respond.
And if you happen to be at Arlington National Cemetery, he's buried in a section known as 210. And yes, I agree
That's the
with everything
story.
Bill said. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks to both of you, Donna, Bill.
Certainly.
This was really, I I don't know. I guess I got started on this because I saw that little word Milo, New York, where WG was born,
Well,
and that was about 7 miles from where I lived.
that
I
is
grew
just
up.
so amazing. Yeah,
Small world.
it
It
is.
is a
Well,
small world. All roads eventually connect, and we're so glad our road has connected with you,
yeah,
Barbara.
it's
Oh,
been wonderful to know and work with you, and we look forward to more.
so
For you.
fortunate enough.
Yes,
Got
it's been
another message. Oh, if you want, folks, you can turn your cameras on so Bill and Donna can see who you are. Uh, but they're saying
oh wow, I
Oh,
see.
I
somebody
see.
grew up in
Yeah,
Husband grew up
Sherburne,
in
a
Sherman.
husband.
yeah.
Wow,
Well, it's such
Yeah.
an interesting area of New York, and
so
so
much
many
history.
people, yeah, that came to the country from other countries, began that migration, and some stayed in New York, and it's just always interesting to see where people, their families grew up, and in this case, Joyce's husband. Very
Yeah.
cool.
Very
Yeah.
cool.
Well, it's quite an interesting area and of history. And I've gone to that Civil War site where they have webinars and they have recordings of previous webinars.
Mhm.
And that is very interesting. And I found that one about the coffee and how
Yes,
the northern
that was
soldiers
interesting.
were able to hog the coffee that came into the country and keep it away from the southern ones. So at least they drank coffee for breakfast, lunch, supper, mealtime, whenever, midnight snack.
Right. And who's to say that wasn't a major factor because I have started every workday of my life with coffee, and
Me
to
as
have been
well.
deprived by it or of it would have consequences. And so yeah, that was fascinating. So
Yeah,
we appreciate getting articles sent our way.
yeah. It's really amazing what you have done, and it. But
Wow.
both of you are kind of like in retirement, like us, all of
Yes,
us.
I say I'm finding my calling now as a water fitness instructor. So I'm
Oh,
doing that. So I'm employed, but we're really largely retired,
Yeah,
gratefully retired.
yeah,
correct.
as are most of us.
Yeah, it's a
Okay.
great group.
Well, it's a great, and it's wonderful to have the time to explore these kind of topics. So,
Yeah. And Bill,
Well,
too, he wouldn't say this, but I will say his book, well, there was a mention of it, his collection of short stories. His real strength, one of them is literary fiction. And he has written a collection of short stories called Otherwise Wretched that's coming out in March. They're gritty. He knows what he's writing about. It's stories of rural Pennsylvania and the West Coast. So if you like gritty,
right. Well, I
good
appreciate it.
writing.
Yeah, and
yeah.
it's been wonderful. It's been the same publishing house in Pennsylvania is bringing that out as well. So,
Well, I wanted to let everyone know um, the last two sessions, today and yesterday's, have been recorded. And the at the second session, Bill gave a very good overview of the first session, and all of that will go on to the YouTube page of Center for Lifetime Study. How to get there, we'll have to find out from Robin, and I'm sure she'll send out a note to everybody letting them know how to find the recording of this.
that'd be,
So um,
that'd be great.
I want to thank you again. You know,
Our pleasure.
Our
if I
pleasure.
could shake
Thank
your
you.
hand, I would.
Yeah, well,
Give you
we're sending you a hug. And
okay.
you've got a good sense of humor.
Okay.
Poor Bill's still coughing, but
All right.
thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.